26 feet down, the water is so dark, the divers work blind. A gloved hand closes on stone. It's a knife, a biface, shaped by hands that meant to shape it, sitting in mud that hasn't shifted since the day it settled. Next to it, a mastodon tusk, scored with deep parallel cuts. The lab returns a number, 14,550 years. That's 15 centuries before the first Americans were permitted to exist. And here's the part nobody wants to talk about. This site had been saying exactly that since the 1980s. Nobody listened. It's called Page-Ladson. It sits on the floor of the Osceola River in North Florida, roughly 30 miles from Tallahassee, inside a sinkhole that swallowed a piece of the ice age and then sealed the lid. You need to picture what the divers are actually working in. This isn't turquoise water with a camera crew hovering nearby. The Osceola is tannic, stained the color of strong tea, and a few meters down the light simply quits. Archaeologists descend with lamps that barely earn their weight, string guidelines, and excavate by feel. They vacuum sediment through a dredge hose. They identify finds by touch, by memory, by the shape of a thing pressing against a glove. They keep going back for one reason. A sinkhole is close to a perfect archive. No plow ever cut it. No burrowing animal churned it. No frost heave, no root growth, no backhoe. The water is oxygen poor, so wood survives, plant matter survives, ivory survives. Sediment falls in layers and stays where it falls, younger above, older below, everything in between them locked in sequence. So when a stone tool comes out of that mud, you don't get to say it fell there. That is the entire controversy in one sentence. The object was never the problem. Stone tools are common. Mastodon bone is common. What made Page-Ladson radioactive was the mud around it, the date attached to it, the order of the layers. Because the biface and the cut-marked tusk sat in a sealed sequence about 1,500 years older than the earliest Americans were supposed to be. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand the wall it hit. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology ran on a single idea. It was called Clovis first, and it was clean, elegant, and wonderfully easy to teach. In 1929, near Clovis, New Mexico, and later at Blackwater Draw, researchers found exquisitely made, fluted spear points lying among mammoth bones. The same points turned up across the continent. They dated to roughly 13,000 years ago. From that came the story. A founding population walked out of Siberia, crossed the Bering Land Bridge, came down an ice-free corridor that opened between two melting ice sheets and filled two continents in a few centuries. Big game hunters, one wave, one route, one start date. I want to be fair here. That model was not stupid. It was built on real evidence. For decades, it survived every test thrown at it. It made predictions, and the predictions held. But a clean story becomes dangerous the moment it turns into a career structure. Clovis, first, did not just describe the past. It wrote a rule. If your site produced a pre-Clovis date, the burden of proof came down on you like masonry. And 4 words could erase almost anything. Disturbed, contaminated, redeposited, geofact. The layer moved, the carbon leached, the rock broke on its own, the excavation was sloppy. Every one of those objections is legitimate. Every one of them is sometimes true. That's precisely what made them so effective. Nobody had to hide a thing. Doubt did the work. Come back to Page-Ladson, because this is where the story turns ugly. The site wasn't discovered in 2016. It was worked through the 1980s and 1990s by teams including James Dunbar and the paleontologist S. David Webb. They brought up stone tools. They brought up the tusk with the long parallel gouges. They ran dates. The dates came back pre-Clovis, and the field broadly filed it under interesting, unproven, and moved on. Sit with that. The evidence was already out of the ground. It was already published. It just sat in the disputed pile for about 20 years because accepting it cost more than dismissing it. Then, between 2012 and 2014, a new team went back down. Jesse Halligan of Florida State and Michael Waters of Texas. A&M took a dive crew into the Blackwater and re-excavated the sinkhole with modern methods. Modern recording, modern dating. They found a biface in place, not floating in a spoil pile, not pulled off a screen, sitting in an undisturbed layer with the sediment sequence intact above and below it. They ran a tight series of radiocarbon dates on plant material from the surrounding sediment. Not one date, a series. 14,550 years, published in Science Advances in 2016. And here's the sting. Nothing new had to be found. The site had been telling this story for a generation. What changed wasn't the mud. What changed was the number of other places saying the same thing. Because Florida wasn't alone. 4,000 miles south, in a peat bog in southern Chile called Monte Verde, Tom Dillahay started digging in the late 1970s. The waterlogged peat had done something almost unheard of. It preserved the soft material: wood, cordage, hearths, plant remains, the remnants of structures, things that normally rot inside a century, still there after 14,000 years. And the field came for it, not with a conspiracy, with papers, reviews, conference sessions, and a steady, grinding insistence that something must be wrong. For nearly 2 decades, Dillehay defended that site. The wood was natural, the dates were off, the stratigraphy was misread, the artifacts weren't artifacts. He wasn't just defending a date, he was defending the possibility that the map itself was wrong. In 1997, a delegation of prominent skeptics, including Vance Haynes, the geoscientist who had been Clovis First's most formidable and most rigorous defender, flew to Chile to see it in person. They conceded in print. That should have ended it. It didn't. Within a couple of years, fresh critiques appeared, the arguments restarted, and the air never really cleared. Dillehay had been right for 20 years. He got no headline. He got exhaustion. And here's the part that should have detonated the whole model and somehow didn't. Monteverde is in southern Chile. That's roughly 14,000 kilometers from the ice-free corridor. If people were living there 14,000 years ago, they didn't arrive the week before. They had to have entered the Americas well earlier, spread across 2 continents, and adapted to desert, mountain, rainforest, and coast on the way. The Chilean date wasn't just a number. It was a distance problem. And distance problems are worse than dates because you can't explain them away with a contaminated sample. North to Pennsylvania. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter is a sandstone overhang about 30 miles southwest of Pittsburgh. James Adovazio began excavating in 1973, and he did it the way you're supposed to. Obsessive recording, tight control, deep stratigraphy, stacked in order like pages in a book. The lowest occupation levels produced dates pushing 16,000 years and beyond. The objection arrived immediately. The site sits in coal country. Critics argued that ancient carbon, coal particulate, dissolved humates carried by groundwater, could have leached into the samples and made them read older than they were. That is a real chemical concern. It deserved to be raised. But watch what happened next. It was raised and raised and raised for decades. And in all that time, nobody demonstrated it. Nobody produced the contaminating carbon. Nobody showed the mechanism operating at Meadowcroft. The objection was asserted, repeated, cited, and deployed. It was never proven. Meanwhile, Adovazio spent a career answering it and became, in much of the field's eyes, the man who couldn't take no for an answer. A difficult personality, someone who kept insisting. That's how it works. You don't have to destroy a discovery. You only have to make the person carrying it look unreasonable and then wait. The objection did its job. It protected the model long after the data stopped justifying it. By now, you might be thinking, fine, a handful of odd sites. Every discipline has those. So let's talk about volume. In 2011, Michael Waters and colleagues published the Deborah L. Friedkin site in central Texas, on Buttermilk Creek. This wasn't one strange rock in one strange layer. It was thousands of stone artifacts, flakes, blades, tools, the ordinary litter of people making things, sitting in a clay layer directly beneath the Clovis material, sealed under the thing that was supposed to be first. The clay was dated by optically stimulated luminescence, which measures the last time mineral grains saw daylight. The result, roughly 15,500 years. And this is where the standard dismissal script breaks, because the script was built for anomalies. One tool, one bone, one date. You can always argue that a single thing slipped through a crack. You cannot argue that an entire workshop floor slipped through a crack. One anomaly is a mistake. 15,000 artifacts is an occupation. Let's be honest about what was actually happening, because I don't want to sell you a villain. There was no secret committee. Nobody locked evidence in a vault. There's no memo. What there was something more ordinary and frankly more effective. Peer review staffed by people whose life's work rested on the old model. Grant panels where proposing to dig for pre-Clovis material meant asking for money to chase a claim the field had already rejected. Textbooks with the corridor drawn on the map, printed and reprinted. Museum dioramas cast in fiberglass with the arrows pointing the only permitted direction, and reputational contagion. Once a site was labeled controversial, standing near it cost you something. Students learn that fast. Advisors make sure of it. None of that requires malice. All of it requires only inertia, and the very human urge to protect a story you've spent 30 years teaching. This isn't a conspiracy. It's certainty defending itself. And certainty defending itself does more damage than any conspiracy because it never has to admit it's doing anything at all. Back to Florida, because Page-Ladson held a second story most people missed: the tusk. Daniel Fisher, a specialist in mastodon and mammoth remains, examined the cut marks. Deep, parallel, running along the shaft in a pattern consistent with someone slicing through the connective tissue that anchors a tusk in its socket, working it free from the skull of a dead animal. Sit with that image. Someone knelt in the mud at the edge of a watering hole beside a dead mastodon and cut the tusk out of its face. Probably for the ivory, probably for the raw material. And then they lost a knife in the muck. And it lay there for 14,500 years, waiting for a diver to find it in the dark. The tool outlived the hand. But the sinkhole had one more thing to say, and this one quietly damaged a different textbook. Researchers analyzed Sporormiella, a fungal spore that grows in the dung of large herbivores. Its abundance in sediment tracks how many big animals were on the landscape. And at Page-Ladson, the spores show megafauna persisting for roughly 2,000 years after humans arrived in the region. That's a problem. For the tidy overkill narrative, where people show up and blitz the megafauna into extinction within a few centuries, people and mastodons appear to have shared that landscape for a very long time. One sinkhole, two textbook stories under strain, and then the debate stopped being about dates and sediment chemistry and molecules and became something anyone could look at and understand. New Mexico, white sands, a dry lake bed inside a national park where gypsum dunes run to the horizon and the wind is forever uncovering and reburying the ground. In the old lakeshore mud, sealed between sediment layers, are human footprints. Not one, not a scatter. Trackways, hundreds of them. The prints were dated using seeds of rupia, an aquatic plant recovered from layers directly above and below the tracks. The result, published in 2021, was between roughly 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. That's not a nudge. That's a wrecking ball. 23,000 years is deep inside the last glacial maximum. The ice sheets were at maximum extent. The corridor was shut. Under the standard model, nobody was supposed to be anywhere south of the ice. Not in New Mexico. Not strolling around a lake. And what those tracks record isn't a hunting party or an abstraction. In one sequence, a young person, an adolescent, or a small adult, judging by the prints, crosses wet mud carrying a toddler. You can see where they set the child down. The tiny prints appear. Then the small prints vanish and the adults get deeper, picked back up, carried on. Elsewhere on the flat, the same mud holds the tracks of mammoth and giant ground sloth. A stone tool you can argue about. You can call it a geofact. Question the layer, question the excavator. A footprint is a person walking. There is no second reading. And the field's response was immediate, and I want to be clear, entirely legitimate. The critique was the hard water reservoir effect. Rupia is an aquatic plant. It takes up carbon from the water it lives in. If that water is fed by ancient groundwater carrying dissolved carbon already thousands of years old, the radiocarbon date on the seed comes out too old. That's a real, well-understood problem. It was the right question to ask. So they went back and tested it a different way. They radiocarbon dated conifer pollen, terrestrial material from trees that pulled their carbon out of the air, not the lake. No reservoir effect possible. Same answer. Then they ran optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains in the sediment itself. An entirely independent method with nothing to do with carbon at all. It measures the last time those grains were exposed to sunlight. Same answer. 3 methods, 2 of them immune to the objection. The 2023 results held the dates. Same answer, same answer, same answer. That was the problem. And once the ceiling breaks, the room above it stops having a floor. In 2020, a team led by Cyprian Ardelian published work from Chiquihuite Cave, high in the mountains of northern Mexico, claiming stone artifacts reaching back as far as 26,500 years. I want to be careful here. This claim is contested and it is not accepted by most of the field. The core criticism is serious. Many researchers argue the so-called tools are geofacts, naturally fractured limestone from a cave that manufactures broken rock all on its own. The debate is unresolved. The skeptics may well be right, but watch what the argument reveals, because the reflex, doubt fast, doubt hard, doubt loudest, is now so deeply trained into this field that it fires on everything. And it's right often enough that nobody ever examines the reflex itself. Which brings me to the strangest chapter in this entire story, and the one where I need you to hear the caveat as loudly as the claim. In 1992, a highway construction crew in San Diego was cutting into a slope for a road expansion. A paleontological monitor spotted bone. They stopped, and they excavated what turned out to be a mastodon. The bones were broken, spiral fractures, the kind you get when bone is smashed while it's still fresh. Around them lay heavy cobbles that looked, to some eyes, like hammerstones and anvils. with damage patterns and stone fragments scattered nearby. They boxed it up. It went into museum storage, and there it sat for 25 years. Then, in 2017, a team published the Kuruti mastodon site in Nature, dating the bone material by uranium-thorium methods to roughly 130,000 years ago, and arguing that some hominin had smashed those bones open. Let me say this as plainly as I can. That claim is overwhelmingly rejected. Most archaeologists do not accept it. The obvious alternative explanation is that the bones were crushed by the heavy machinery of a highway excavation. There are no stone tools at the site, no cut marks, no human remains, nothing else in the deposit that says people. The specialists who reviewed it and pushed back hard were not being cowardly. They were being correct. So why does it belong in this story at all? Because of where it came from. A museum drawer, a box on a shelf, a site that had been dug, bagged, cataloged, and forgotten for a quarter of a century, until somebody went back and looked with new methods and asked a question that had been unaskable. And because of what its existence tells you about the state of the argument 20 years earlier, a claim like Kuruti would have been unpublishable, laughed out of the room before it reached review. It got into Nature not because the evidence was strong, but because 13,000 years had stopped being a wall. Once the ceiling came down, the argument no longer had an agreed-upon edge. But there's a much better question sitting underneath all of this, and it's the one that actually solves the mystery. If people were in Florida at 14,500 years, in Chile at 14,500, in Texas at 15,500, in Pennsylvania at 16,000, and in New Mexico at 23,000, then where is the trail? Where are the sites leading from Alaska down to all of them? Why is the record so thin? Here's the answer, and it's almost funny in a bleak way. They were digging in the wrong place. Look at the Channel Islands off the coast of California. The human remains known as Arlington Springs Man date to roughly 13,000 years. And here's the thing about those islands. They were never connected to the mainland, not at the lowest sea level, not ever. Somebody crossed open water to get there. Go north to the coast of British Columbia. On Calvert Island, archaeologists excavated below a modern beach and found human footprints pressed into ancient clay around 13,000 years old. Nearby, Haida Gwaii has produced early coastal sites of its own. Those weren't people who wandered down an inland corridor between two ice sheets. Those were people who lived on a coast, ate from a coast, and moved along a coast. That's the model researchers like John Erlandson have pushed for years. A Pacific Rim coastal route, sometimes called the Kelp Highway. A marine ecosystem rich in fish, shellfish, seals, and seaweed, running from Northeast Asia around the rim and down the American West Coast. No corridor required, no ice to wait for, just a boat, a shoreline, and time. And now, the killer detail. At the height of the Ice Age, sea level was roughly 120 meters lower than it is today. The coastline those people walked is gone. It's underwater. It's kilometers offshore, buried under sediment on the continental shelf, drowned by the same melting ice that let the rest of us into the story. For 50 years, archaeologists searched the interior of North America, found little, and treated that absence as proof. The evidence isn't missing, it's submerged. And then the genetics arrived and made the whole thing messier. In Montana, at a site called Anzick, the remains of an infant were found. A Clovis-era child, roughly 12,700 years old, buried with red ochre and stone tools, not a specimen. A child, buried by people who cared enough to cover them in pigment and lay tools beside them. In 2014, the genome was sequenced, and it linked directly to the ancestry of most present-day indigenous peoples across the Americas. Then, Upward Sun River in Alaska produced something else. A population geneticists call the ancient Beringians, a lineage that split from the ancestors of other Native Americans far earlier than the tidy corridor timeline had room for. People sitting in Beringia, separated for thousands of years before anyone walked south. And then there's the signal nobody can explain. Researchers including Pontus Skoglund and David Reich reported a faint genetic affinity between some Amazonian populations and groups in Australasia. It's real in the data. It has never been satisfactorily explained. Whoever carried that signal into South America, we have not found their bones. Genetics didn't just add a date, it added waves, plural, and at least one ghost. So where does that leave us? Here's what is solid. Pre-Clovis is not a fringe position anymore, it's the consensus. Monteverde is accepted. Page-Ladson is accepted. Friedkin holds. Meadowcroft's dates have never been shown to be contaminated. People were in the Americas well before 13,000 years ago, and the coastal route is now the leading explanation. Here's what is contested. White Sands has survived 3 independent dating approaches, and the case is strong, but its full implication, a human presence at the peak of the Ice Age, is still being fought over, and honest researchers still disagree. Here's what is not accepted. Chiquihuite is disputed. Karuti is rejected by nearly everyone, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The Amazonian signal is unexplained, not solved. And here's what never happened. There was no reckoning. Clovis first did not collapse in public. Nobody stood up at a conference and apologized to Tom Dillehay for 20 years of siege. Nobody wrote to James Adovasio and said, we should have tested our objection instead of repeating it. No textbook printed a correction. No museum label said, we were wrong and we were wrong loudly and it cost people. The model just faded. The corridor arrow got smaller. New maps quietly added a coastal line. Papers stopped mentioning the fight. Museum panels softened into cautious phrasing. Recent evidence suggests the timing remains under investigation. A generation of students learned the new version and never knew there had been a war. The retreat happened in footnotes. Dillehay and Adovasio were not vindicated with a headline. They were vindicated with silence. And that's the thing I can't shake. The doubt was reasonable. Every single objection was scientifically defensible. That's precisely what made it so effective as a weapon. Nobody had to burn the evidence. They only had to call it contamination long enough for the people carrying it to get tired. So go back down into the oscilla, back through the tannin black water, past the guideline, into the sediment where the light doesn't reach. That biface is still down there in the mud in your imagination, sealed in a layer that never moved, next to a tusk somebody cut free with their hands 14,500 years ago, on a day at a watering hole that nobody recorded and nobody remembers. It waited 30 years for a field that wasn't ready to hear it. Now pull back up through the river, out over the Florida coast, and keep going. Past the beach, past the surf, out over the shelf where the water gets deep and dark and stays that way. Somewhere under all of that is a shoreline. Camps, hearths, middens, the actual road these people took. It took 3 decades to accept one sinkhole in Florida. How long is it going to take before anyone goes looking down there?